brought us Africa's greatest entrepreneurs. Now she's turned her attention to South Africa in her new book, South Africa's Greatest Entrepreneurs. I'm talking about Moky Makura. She joins us now to discuss the inspiration behind her latest offering. Moky, thank you very much for coming through. You've come full circle, some people would say. What's brought you to this point?
Well, after the first book, which was about African entrepreneurs, there were 16 of them and only 4 of them were from South Africa. Yeah. A lot of people came up to me and said, when are you doing your next book? And also, what struck me was that if there were only 4 South Africans in the previous book, and it was a really well-bought book, a lot of people bought the book. And I thought, well, look, here's an opportunity to actually tell the stories of the entrepreneurs I missed out in the first book. And that's essentially what I tried to do. Okay,
so you're profiling 22 business people defined as successful and visionary. Can you just talk us through the definition of what constitutes success and vision in this particular book?
Well, I think what constitutes success is if you look at the brands that some of the people in this book have started, Mnet, ShopRite Checkers, Macro. I mean, we can go through all the names. These are household names now, and those have been started by the people in this book. They are some of the biggest employers in the country. That, to me, is the definition of success. These businesses, well, we've called them empires. These people have built their empires. But it all started with an inkling of an idea of one person, and that's why we call them entrepreneurs. It's been somebody's drive, somebody's vision that's actually ended up in a very, very successful business.
The reason I'm asking about the characteristics is because you've chosen a diverse range of people, from Sol Kerzner and Pam Golding, property giants and hoteliers, to fashion designers and filmmakers like Anand Singh and Kensani Manganye. Cross-section, how do all their stories sort of form a common thread?
Well, the stories themselves are about anybody who started a business, and that's the key thing, that these people started businesses. So the sector they're from was almost irrelevant, but we actually tried to be reflective of South African society. So we've got women in there, and there's definitely 4 very powerful women in there, and we've tried to get a cross-section of people who started businesses, and all the people in here are pretty much household names. I mean, I don't think there's any names that people don't know about, but what I found is a lot of people don't know the stories.
Tell us about those stories.
Well, gosh, where do I start? There's a book, go and buy it. But to be honest, the stories, to me, inspire. They are of people who actually got up, they had an idea, and they made it happen. They didn't have anything special. They didn't necessarily have a special education, but what they did have was drive. And that's the key thing that I think, anybody who's buying this book will get out of it. I mean, the one key thing for me is that Gibbs got involved because they obviously are doing an MBA for entrepreneurs, because I think entrepreneurs right now are going to shape this country. They are going to be the biggest employers.
Oh, well, we know that you're doing an MBA at Gibbs, Andrew Duvenage. Just talk to us about, without necessarily looking at the iconic figures in the book, but just tell us about, in your mind's eye, what constitutes a great business leader, a great entrepreneur?
Well, I think South Africa is characterized by them. I mean, there are so many examples, and I think you would have been tough on space over there, because 22 is definitely not the limit of it. And traditionally, you've seen, as you mentioned, some of our biggest employers, which are massive corporates now, be they an Investec, be it a First Rand Group, you name it, is those originally came from entrepreneurial source. And what you found is these people started with an idea, sometimes with limited capital, but essentially with the skill to make it into something bigger and scale it up.
All right, let's talk about how you got all the submissions together. You've approached various writers to conduct interviews, tell these stories for you, and then put it together. What was their brief? What were they supposed to go out there and look for?
Well, what we're looking for were the stories. So we weren't looking for corporate profiles. We weren't looking for, deals. We were looking for the stories of how the businesses were made, because that's what inspires. That's what actually gets people. It's the stories. So, I once had somebody ask me a question. What are we going to learn about business from this book? You'll learn a hell of a lot, because actually stories communicate, and that's actually what we've tried to do with the book. So we use some of the best writers in the country. We've used a lot of business writers from Financial Mail, from Business Day. So we've got top-class writing in here, and they're telling fabulous stories about amazing people who've achieved.
I've often found when I read biographies of people, and I know these are not quite biographies, is that some of the most successful leaders, business, political, and civic leaders, are people who've endured some kind of adversity. They've often failed before picking themselves up again to become successful. Do we hear that as a common thread?
You know what? Every single person in here has failed in something they've done. It's how they treat it, because some people have seen it as another challenge, something to get round, or they've just thought, okay, well, no, it's not going to work, I'm going to move on. But it's not the kind of failure that has stopped them moving forward, because if it had, they wouldn't be in this book. So although we don't focus on the failure, it forms part of most people's stories, but it's often brought out as this is a learning, this is something they learned that they couldn't do it this way, or that this wasn't going to work. So failure is definitely a positive thing, but we haven't gone on and on about it, because it's their stories and it's how they want to portray themselves.
Okay, for somebody watching from outside of South Africa, because we've got a Pan-African audience, and knowing the content of the first book, Africa's Greatest Entrepreneurs, is there a huge dichotomy in terms of how these entrepreneurs have operated in the South African environment versus some of the challenges that their counterparts face across Africa? Or is it just the triumph of the human spirit, where it doesn't really matter where you are, what conditions you faced, they've all just done it methodically, as it were?
I think yes, to a certain extent. It has sort of happened that they've just done it, that wherever these people were, I believe that whichever country these guys ended up in, they would have been successful. But South Africa has its own unique environment, for example, apartheid, which actually affected quite a few people in the book, particularly the black entrepreneurs in the book, and how they approached it and how they got over it. It makes their story even more amazing. But also some of the things that you'll read about in the book, the way the market was segmented. For example, Alan Craig talks about Vodacom and how he was the first person to introduce prepaid to a market where he couldn't sell contracts because black people didn't have credit records. So it's interesting, but there's certain circumstances that were unique to South Africa, but I still think it makes interesting business reading, because at the end of the day, there's still business challenges and you've got to find your way around them, and that's what these guys did.